Okay then. Dyna ni. Felly, Pryn hawn da bawb, a chroeso mawr I chi i'r sesiwn Haf DPP hon. Good afternoon to the three of you and welcome to this summer of CPD session. Ar ran y tîm cymorth I ysgolion gydag ieithoedd rhyngwladol yma ym Mhrifysgol Abertawe, hoffwn I ddiolch I chi gyd am fynychu'r sesiwn yma heddiw. On behalf of the International Languages School Support Team here at Swansea University, I'd like to thank you all for attending today's webinar. Mae ein sesiynau Haf DPP wedi ei datblygu yn dilyn digwyddiadau ieithoedd rhyngwladol ar gyfer disgyblion ysgol a gynhaliwyd eleni ar gampws y Brifysgol gyda chefnogaeth gan Lywodraeth Cymru. Ac felly rydym wrth ein boddau yn gallu cynnig cyfres o 5 sesiwn DPP ar-lein a gynlluniwyd o amgylch yr adborth a'r ceisiadau a dderbyniwyd gan athrawon. Summer of CPD events have been developed following the university's international language events for school pupils, which have taken place over the course of this academic year with support from the Welsh Government. So we're delighted to now be able to offer a series of 5 online CPD sessions, which are designed around feedback and the requests received from teachers. Mae ein rhaglen o webinarau yn ymdrin ag amrywiaeth o bynciau a gynlluniwyd nid yn unig I gynorthwyo athrawon, ond I rannu syniadau, ysgogi trafodaeth ac annog creaduriaeth a chydweithio. Ac felly rydym yn gobeithio y byddwch yn gweld y sesiwn heddiw yn ddefnyddiol. So our program of webinars it covers a variety of different topics and it's designed not only to assist teachers, but to share ideas, stimulate discussion and encourage creativity and collaboration. And we therefore hope that you will find today's session useful. I'm just going to switch over to my other slides. Okay then. So today's session is with myself. My name is Jenkins. I am a Welsh and Spanish teacher and I'm part of the International Languages School Support Team here at Swansea University. The topic of today's session is Pinterest and Padlet, content curation hubs for language teaching. I'll begin today with a brief explanation of the theoretical framework around some of my research. We'll then look at how the practical elements of my research were carried out. And finally, we'll look at some student feedback and then some suggestions. Now, the practical elements of my research were conducted with a group of 18 and 19-year-old language students and also with groups of adult learners. However, I feel that the techniques, the methodology, the practical elements here are transferable to school-age students, with the activities being scalable and tailorable to your context. So my research focuses primarily on the role of students' personal interests in language learning and language teaching. Specifically, it explores how we can use digital content, digital tools to reflect students' personal interests and personalised language lessons and teaching resources. I'm particularly interested in discovering how we can make our language lessons more relevant to students. And consequently, I'm interested in discovering whether we are able to increase student engagement, student motivation during our lessons. And when I started my research project, I was really pleased to discover that others have also been researching the importance of personal interests in language learning. For example, in 2011, Ushioda noted that we must encourage our students to view the target language as a means of self-expression and self-development. In other words, we need to engage their own identities and interests in our lessons and promote a sense of continuity between what they learn and do in the classroom and who they are and what they're interested in doing in their lives outside the classroom now and in the future. And I love this idea of a continuity between who students are inside and outside the classroom, so combining the target language with who they are in their everyday lives. And Cole wrote in 2021 in a book that I would actually really recommend to AS and A-level students. It's called Modern Languages, Why It Matters. She wrote that the more we are able to integrate our language learning with our other interests, the more likely it is we are able to maintain our motivation and continue making progress with our learning. So I asked myself, to what extent can this integration of languages and personal interests sustain student motivation? What kind of impact can it have? And something really interesting, I discovered that a group of researchers in the field of mathematics have been exploring the concept of context personalization, with the aim of making their mathematics lessons more relevant to their students. To explain the concept, two of the researchers, Wilkinson and Benaki, describe that context personalization is an instructional principle that involves finding ways to match instructional content to learners' out-of-school interests. Context personalization can involve matching instruction to topic areas that individual or groups of students are interested in, inserting familiar and interest-related references into instructional materials, or supporting learners in seeing how an academic subject relates to their out-of-school interests. And I absolutely loved this theory, and it really inspired me because in addition to mathematics, I think it's also something really important for us to explore in the world of language teaching. Now, there are some practical elements to consider. Wilkinson, Benaki, and a fellow academic named Haryakovich pointed out that when considering the concept of context personalization, we must take into account three aspects, which are called depth, grain size, and ownership. So regarding depth, what they mean is, are we trying to create a personalized context that is truly deep and meaningful for students? Or are we doing it in a more of a superficial way? Related to this, we have grain size. That is, are we aiming to include the specific individual interests of our students, or perhaps the more general interests of a group? They also propose that we consider the concept of ownership, i.e., who is responsible for personalizing the learning context. And there are different levels here. For example, curriculum designers have to think more broadly. They have to consider a wider audience. Whereas we, as teachers, we more or less get to know our students, and we can certainly try to personalize activities and materials to some extent. However, if an individual student can take some responsibility for personalizing their learning, that's where we can really see the benefits and the impact of the theory. So, starting from this theoretical foundation, I wanted to try and find a way to bring this theory into the classroom. My goal was to create personalised, contextualised language lessons for my students, connected to their personal interests. I wanted to try and spark more lively and natural opportunities to practice speaking. And I wanted to observe the effects of the theory and measure the students' engagement. To do this, firstly, I taught a series of 6-week Spanish courses, one class per week, to students at A2, B1 and B2 levels. Each class included several different activities, but among them, some activities based on Pinterest. and specifically its role as a content curation platform. I chose Pinterest for its ease of use and primarily used it as a tool to encourage speaking practice in the classroom. So, what is Pinterest? For those of you who don't know or who haven't used it, Pinterest is basically a digital notice board. It's a place where we can save content that is of interest to us. We can create a pin with any kind of content, videos, photos, articles, blogs, web pages, podcast songs, you name it, you can probably pin it. It's a very easy to use platform. You can use it on computers, you can use it on phones. The app is quite user friendly. And overall, at least in my opinion, it's a really useful tool that can be used in language teaching. So how was Pinterest used in these classes? Each lesson, we used it for around 15 to 20 minutes, mainly to give students opportunities to practice their speaking skills. But they also had the chance to practice writing in Spanish a little bit as well. So the practical steps, the task required some prior student participation. Before the course began, the students were asked to each create a Pinterest board and to add me as a collaborator. Before each class, students had to post content that interested them onto their boards in a very flexible way. They could create pins with anything they wanted, anything they'd seen that they were reading in their day-to-day lives. I also gave them flexibility regarding the language of the content because many of my students actually spoke a variety of languages. So for me, it didn't really matter which language the content was in, since the idea was we would be using it, discussing it in Spanish during the course. For me, the important thing was that it was something that was of personal interest to them. The students were also asked to write what's known in Pinterest as a note, i.e., write something short in Spanish about each item. They were encouraged to write just something short, just to practice their Spanish writing, because it was an opportunity for them to use the language in a context that interested them personally. So here are some examples of the Pinterest boards that students created during their course. We can see a variety of different topics related to their lives, to their interests. As I already mentioned, they had freedom to include whatever they wanted really on their boards. And we can see that each board is different, which is great because it's a reflection of the students themselves, their own personalities. And here we can also see some examples of what they wrote. So things that were of interest to them, things that were relatively meaningful, perhaps. Now, again, I just want to remind us of the theories of depth, grain size, and ownership, because with the activities carried out using Pinterest, different levels of depth, grain size, and ownership were used. So what did we actually do with the boards? Initially, during this 20-minute part of the lesson, students would discuss their latest pins with a partner or a small group. They would simply talk about what they had posted on their Pinterest board that week. This then generated comments and questions from their classmates. It sparked interactions among the students and very natural conversations about topics of personal interest to them. The activity also sparked questions about vocabulary and grammar, both among the students, their groups, and also with myself. And this happened quite naturally because often when we are learning a language, we don't quite realise what vocabulary we're missing until we actually need to use it. So this was an opportunity for the students to become aware of the vocabulary, the grammar that they lacked, in order to be able to talk about topics that were of interest to them, topics connected to their lives. It was a chance to focus in and learn some language that was truly relevant to their lives. It's important to emphasize that this main activity was student-led. In other words, the students had the ownership of the activity. And that's what I was really aiming for, because with that, it meant that we had greater depth. The activity was more meaningful to the students. It also meant that in terms of the level of personalization, the grain size, we were doing something truly connected to the students' individual interests. With this Pinterest concept, it's also possible to create activities that are more teacher-led rather than student-led. However, this then means that the ownership, the grain size, the depth, they do change somewhat. The teacher now has the ownership of the activity. With the grain size, we are now adapting to a broader group of students. And as for depth, the activity, it's less likely to be directly related to individual interests. But we can still try and ensure that there's some common theme of interests for our students. For example, before class, the teacher can prepare some questions based on collective pins, collective ideas. As a collaborator on the students' boards, I could see what they put on their boards before each lesson, the pins, what they'd written. I could observe trends. And this then allowed me to facilitate or encourage class discussions on topics of common interest. So a very simple example, but one week I noticed that many students, by chance, had put photos of coffee on their boards. And it's amazing how something as simple as coffee can generate so much conversation among students about such a wide variety of topics. So we don't always need to try and find a really complex subject to discuss. Sometimes the simplest things are really what spark the most engaging classroom discussions. Some of the teacher-led activities can also be based on linguistic aspects. So as I mentioned earlier, students were encouraged to write something about each pin they placed on their board. And as a collaborator, I could review what they wrote and then in class anonymously highlight some different examples and language points. For example, some good examples, perhaps the students used some interesting vocabulary, and I like being able to showcase these positive moments in language learning and share them with the wider group. It's nice to be able to learn from each other, exchange ideas. This can also be used to show examples of recent language topics. For example, in class, if we've covered a certain grammar topic in previous lessons, and I then see that someone has used it correctly on their board, it's a good opportunity to show it to the group in a real life context. It's also an opportunity to identify some errors and work together through them. So we as teachers can choose some incorrect examples, keeping them anonymous, of course, and then work together to correct them. So it's a way of working together as a team, collaborating, improving our grammar, and once again, seeing the language used in a context that's more relevant and personal to the students. So some student feedback. I wanted to find out what the students thought about this concept. So after this Spanish course, I asked them to complete an anonymous survey about their experiences and the different aspects of using Pinterest. So firstly here, we have some comments about the activities, the concept itself. And the idea of using pins or of bringing content into the classroom received a lot of positive feedback. I've selected here some example comments and I've just highlighted some key words. So for example, I prefer being able to speak about things I enjoy and are new and up to date. With this kind of activity, I gain more confidence in my abilities. We got to speak in depth about things that really matter to us, which was huge for improvement. I can tell now when I speak, I have new vocabulary that I didn't have before. It felt like a natural conversation, very free-flowing. I got to learn new vocabulary about topics of interest. For this one, I tend to speak about these topics in English on a regular basis, so it was good to be able to do it in Spanish too. So we had many positive comments about the concept itself. And there were also lots of positive comments about Pinterest as a platform. So for example, it's an easy and accessible way to collate ideas and content. I now have a mood board of things I like doing and want out of life, so thank you for that. The style is engaging and fun. I'd never used it before, but really enjoyed it. Personal enough, but not too invasive. Okay. It was a good method. Laura was able to correct the grammar mistakes as she had access to our boards. And we could talk about us and our lives a bit more, which built confidence. However, there were also some negative comments, and it is important to take these into consideration. For example, I did really enjoy these parts of the lesson, but they relied more on students inputting the content themselves. So on weeks when I had time to do this, I got a lot out of it. But when I wasn't able to prepare properly, it was less enjoyable because I hadn't done my part. Or I think this is a good platform to bring into learning. There are some shortcomings when students haven't had time to prepare. Okay, so it seems that perhaps the fact that preparation was required for the tasks, that may be an important factor for us to consider. Another thing, although the Pinterest activity was great and so unique, I did sometimes feel like I wanted a bit more structure. And so it may be advisable to adjust the balance between student-led and teacher-led elements of these activities, the ownership element. Perhaps whilst students may enjoy a more natural conversation, a greater level of teacher intervention could be beneficial. And then someone said, I wasn't really engaged with the Pinterest boards of the other students. Now, this is also a good point. It's important to keep this in mind, because whilst our personal interests may be really interesting to us, the interests of other people perhaps less so. And something else, it was nice, but I don't use it on a daily basis, so it was not straightforward. Maybe using a different platform. Okay, that's fine. So perhaps Pinterest isn't for everyone. Perhaps there may be some other platforms out there that are easier to use. So based on this, and also actually based on the fact that Pinterest, since this project began, has unfortunately modified some of its functionalities, and there are limitations now in terms of what you're actually able to write on a post. So for a few reasons, in the autumn term, I switched from Pinterest to Padlet and tried some very similar activities, but this time with some of my Welsh language students. Now, Padlet is a very similar platform in many ways, perhaps easier to use. So again, it allows you to place lots of different types of content onto a board. It's available as an app on a computer. You can write things on it. And having used both platforms, I think I actually now prefer Padlet as a content curation hub. Now, this time I had a smaller group, so I created a shared board instead of asking students to create their own individual boards. And while this might reduce the personalization somewhat, it also made the activities quite collaborative in nature. And again, I received some positive feedback from the Welsh language students too. It seems like they, along with the Spanish language students, appreciated the opportunity to spend 15-20 minutes of a class talking about topics of personal interest. So, for example, I was determined to never miss a week and always add something to the board. It was good to talk about what I wanted to talk about in lessons. It was more personal. I like the extra speaking practice outside the main course materials. It helped me use the language to talk about my own life. So at the beginning of the session, I briefly mentioned scalability and the transferable nature of this concept across to school groups. So I therefore like to offer a few simple suggestions. So aside from the highly free nature of some of the activities described today, you as school teachers could perhaps set themes. You could ask students, to all add an item, a piece of content relating to a certain theme onto their boards. You could ask everyone to place something food related, something to do with a place, clothing, books, series. Students could then discuss together and compare what they've added to their boards in the lesson. You could also use these platforms to explore cultural themes. You could ask students to add something from a target language speaking country, an example of food, a piece of art, a film, etc. Or how about incorporating other school subjects? So connecting languages with their broader education. Students could add examples of homework from other subjects, projects they're working on, different things from different lessons, and then discuss those in their target language. This could also be used for project-based learning. You could create collective, collaborative class boards based around different topics and themes. Perhaps in lessons you're exploring a certain city or country, a film, a certain person, and students could contribute to building up a knowledge base on that topic and contribute to building up a hub of content on the topic. Individual boards could also be used as a student portfolio. So by gradually adding different items to their boards, by the end of the term, the end of the school year, students will have a large hub of content centered around their study of the target language. Or group work. It's also very easy to do on the likes of Padlet. Students can all add something to a shared board. They can collaborate, perhaps build a presentation together. And I'm sure you'll have lots of ideas based on your own teaching context. So please feel free to share some ideas if you'd like to. And that's it from me. So if anyone has explored personalization, content curation platforms, the role of personal interest in language learning, I would love to have a chat with you. So here is my email address, and thank you very much for attending. Thank you for listening. Diolch yn fawr. Diolch. Okay, dyna ni. Felly, oes cwestiwn gyda unrhyw un? If anyone has any questions, please feel free to pop something in the chat, or please feel free to pop on your microphone, your cameras if you'd like to. Okay, I can see some questions in the chat. As beginners of Spanish, Laura, did they cope okay with writing sentences in Spanish? I'm just thinking Suna Kisha would maybe struggle due to lack of language verbs. So my students were, the lowest level were A2 students. So they did have a basic knowledge of the language, but I always encouraged them to write very, very short sentences. So the sentences didn't have to be long, very, very short. So if they put something about a film that they'd watched, I was happy for the sentence to be as simple as me gusta esta película, full stop if they want to, or me gusta esta película porque esta película es, okay, some kind of adjective. So you're right, students would need some basic language to be able to do this, but I was very open to the sentences being relatively short. And how do you ensure they have the language tools to communicate with one another? So again, I did this with A2 students and above, so they do already have a basic level of language. But the idea was that these discussions were never overly complex, okay? They were things that the students had put themselves onto the board, the things that students were therefore interested in. So the kind of language they were generally using was fairly descriptive in terms of their perhaps reasons. So I like this because I watched this film yesterday, I went to this place, I'm going to this place. And the questions being asked from other students were then fairly straightforward as well. With the higher level students, the B1 and the B2 level students, of course, then they were able to elaborate in far greater detail. But for the A2 level students, it was fairly basic level language, but they seemed really engaged with it. I think largely because it was personal to them. They were largely able to speak about whatever they wanted. Do you think it'd work with Key Stage 3 or perhaps better suited to Key Stage 4 when they have knowledge of grammar and tense instead? I mean, really, each to their own with this. I think you can be experimental. Key Stage 4, absolutely, why not? I mean, by then they will have a better knowledge of grammar and tenses. I don't see why it couldn't be used with Key Stage 3. You'll know your students, you'll know their capacity, what they're able to do. If you think they have a decent enough understanding of some simple language structures, for example, in Spanish, me gusta, no me gusta, j'aime, je n'aime pas, why not? Give it a go. So as I said, it doesn't just have to be used for speaking practice. That was the focus of my research, but it could be used for other purposes as well. Project-based work, perhaps developing writing skills, looking at grammar being used in context. It doesn't just have to be speaking. I think you can be creative with it because you know your students a lot better. Yeah. Okay. I'm definitely going to try it with my beginners next year. Yeah, I mean, I definitely encourage it. I mean, I've been teaching an A1 level group this year. By the end of the year, I think they definitely could have attempted it. I tried something a little bit different with them, less on the digital side. And towards the end of the year, I asked them just to bring an item into the lesson, a physical item. So people brought all kinds of different things, books, pots, items of clothing, loads of different things, mugs, yeah, loads of things. And they were able to give a brief explanation with regards to what they'd brought in and why they liked it, what the meaning behind it was, the story. Because by the end of A1, students did have a basic understanding of some different tenses. So they have some present tense, they had some past tense, they were able to construct some things in the future tense as well. So I think it's definitely doable, at least from my perspective, towards the end of an A1 course. But, you know, in terms of personalization, I think that's something that you can probably tell I'm a huge fan of, and I would love to experiment with it more and just see how early we can actually start doing this. At what point will the students have enough language to be able to take advantage of these personalization techniques? And always, you know, seeing the bigger picture of languages, connecting it to their real world, connecting it to who they are, connecting it to their wider studies. I'll give it a go with Key Stage 3 and let you know. Yes, please do. That would be really good. That would be really good. And in the session we had yesterday with Wendy, she was talking about a technique called group talk, which she'd been trialing with year 8 students. And again, it was very much based around giving students the opportunity to speak very, very freely. So the examples we had in yesterday's webinar, which you'll also be able to see on the recording, was they were given some pictures around a certain theme, so football or fashion or food, and they had to essentially try their best to have a natural conversation based on that topic. And we saw some quite interesting videos in yesterday's webinar about that. Ariane, yes, for my beginners, perhaps something around what they did at the weekend, for existence, what they would like, yeah, what they would like to go. Exactly, like we don't have to, you know, be choosing highly complex subject with this. You know, the question, what did you do over the weekend? That can generate so much language, so many opportunities to use different kinds of language, to talk about different things. So yeah, often I think the more simple the topic is, often the more successful it is in lessons. I think the example I gave today just happened to be on coffee, just because I noticed one week lots of students, very coincidentally, had all just put nice photos of coffees that they had been drinking. That conversation went on for ages. It's amazing where a simple topic, you know, the different sort of avenues you can go down with that topic. And then when will we get the recordings, Laura? I believe later on in the summer, Rian, they will be available. So we'll certainly let you all know when they are. Okay, great. Does anyone have any other questions? No? Okay, well, in that case, thank you very much for joining us. Diolch yn fawr iawn I chi am ddod. Oh, I can see someone's writing in the chat. Just hang on for a second. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Okay, diolch yn fawr. Bendigedig, diolch yn fawr iawn I chi. Thank you so much for attending. And as you may have seen at the start, we have 5 sessions in total. So if you would like to join any of the others, you are very, very welcome. We'd love to see you there. Felly, diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. All right, I'm going to stop.